Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this third in our series of 5 webinars today on the subject of preparing for delay analysis. I'm Alex Johnson, partner at Freeths. We're a law firm. I'm joined as ever by partner at Kingsfield Academy.
Afternoon.
And we also magic and keep everything on track. This, as I mentioned, is the third in our series of 5 webinars. We concluded early October, and we're discussing how to overcome the burden of delay and cost overruns in the context of our topic, which is the psychology of claims. In the previous webinar, we looked at the topic of delay, liquidated damages, and extension of time. So in this webinar, we're going to explore schedule delay analysis, which links in with that previous topic. Now, schedule delay is often considered something of a dark art that is little understood by mere mortals. But in this session, we're going to try to explain why that perception exists and how parties can prepare effectively for schedule delay analysis, and in doing so, cut the costs of it. The webinar is for 1 hour. We've got quite a lot of content, but we'll answer questions at the end if we have the time. So if the topics that we discuss make you think of any questions or issues that you're having on your projects, please note them down and submit them, and Wayne will send them to us, and if we have time, we'll try to answer them. Otherwise, if you have questions after the webinar, just email us and we can discuss that directly with you. Right, to get started, as will be clear to any of you who joined us last time, delay claims are complex. They are typically made where one party wishes to recover from the other and/or compensation for the additional time spent on the project and the resources used to complete the project. And remember, as we discussed last time, time and money claims are separate, so they need to be claimed separately. Fortunately, this webinar is focusing on time, the time aspects of a delay claim. So in other words, how does a party establish that it is entitled to an extension of time? Let's start by looking at what is delay. Delay, unfortunately, is a common occurrence on engineering construction projects, although it lacks any real technical meaning, and I've always found it interesting that it's not defined by any industry standard contract. Now, that's not particularly helpful, given how costly and disruptive to a project a delay can be. If we take a dictionary definition of delay, it's to make something happen at a later time than originally planned or expected. Now, that's of some use, I think, when we consider delay in the context of engineering construction projects. Because when we talk about delay in projects, we are usually referring to 2 matters, and they are related. The first is delay is a period of time that extends an engineering construction project beyond the original planned date for its completion. And it also refers to the result of an event or a series of events that impact on the performance of a particular activity or a sequence of activities in accordance with the schedule or the program, which postpones the planned start for a particular activity or sequence of activities, but which does not affect the original completion date. So this helps us to draw a distinction at this point between a critical delay and a non-critical delay, which we sometimes refer to as lateness. A critical delay is a delay that impacts a critical activity that has the effect of extending the overall project completion date beyond the original contractual completion date. In a typical project, about 20% of activities are critical activities. Comparing that to non-critical delay or lateness, that is delay to activities on a schedule such that they start or they finish later than planned, but which doesn't impact on the critical path. It doesn't affect the original project completion date. Now, lateness consumes float, and float is the time available in an activity in addition to its planned duration. So another way of expressing all of this is that critical delay is caused where delay affects activities that lie on the project's critical path. And the critical path is the longest sequence of activities through a project from its start to its finish, the sum of whose durations determines the overall project duration. Now, there's a lot of words in what I just said there. So I think we should illustrate this by a much simpler example. We're going to do a very simple project, and the project is to make an omelette. Now, to make an omelette, we have to heat the oil in a pan, beat 3 eggs, top it with cheese, and cook it for 5 minutes. So let's have a poll, Wayne, if we can. Which activities are on our omelette's critical path? Now, I appreciate this may test your knowledge of cookery more than critical path delay, but let's see how you get on. Please select those answers that you think apply. We've got some results coming through. Let's have a look. Okay, it's an interesting spread of results. Most people want to cook the omelette. That's good. And the all of the above caught people, which is also interesting. Okay, so strictly speaking, the critical path runs through the activities: heat the oil, beat the eggs, cook it for 5 minutes. If we fail to do any of those things, we don't have an omelette. And the other activity, topping it with cheese, while you may debate this amongst yourselves, it's actually a non-critical activity. If, for example, we dropped all the eggs on the floor in the process of making the omelette, we would have a critical path delay, which is us going to the shops to buy some more eggs. It's all a bit of a silly example, but I think it illustrates critical delay versus non-critical delay. And critical delay is fundamental to any extension of time claim. Non-critical delay, so the delay that doesn't impact on the original completion date, doesn't lead to an extension of time. But it's worth mentioning that non-critical delays, if they accumulate, they can accumulate to the point where they do become critical. Now, in a project schedule, the critical path is a function of the logic that is applied by the scheduler who prepared the program to begin with. And activities will change in status, whether they're critical or non-critical, as the project progresses. What does all of this have to do with delay claims? Now, if we go back to some of the principles that we discussed in the first webinar, remember the party who makes a claim has to establish on the balance of probabilities, which is the burden of proof in English civil law cases, that it has an entitlement to an extension of time. That is the hurdle that it must overcome in order to substantiate its claim. Now, to do that, the party making the claim needs to show the critical path for the project, and they need to explain the events that cause delay to the critical path. Parties will often rely upon expert evidence from schedule delay experts to do this. And the task of lawyers is to establish which party was responsible for the events causing the delay, although we generally rely on delay experts to investigate its causes for us. Now, hopefully that introduction tees us up for the rest of today's discussion, and I'll hand over to John. John, do you have any practical observations on the subject of schedule delay analysis?
I think the first thing is that delay analysis is really a specialist activity, and not all planners and schedulers are able to undertake delay analysis, especially when we start talking about complex projects. So I think that's the first point. Organizations usually appoint delay analysis and analysts for making or defending EOT claims when they either don't have the specialist skills in-house, or they anticipate that the claims are going to end up in dispute and they want an expert witness to prepare a report and give evidence and explain the delays on their behalf. So those are the two real drivers, I think. You mentioned delay analysis as a black art. Yeah, I think that's a polite way of putting it. I mean, it's definitely more art than science. And, some people might argue that it's a science. I think the important thing is that, and you mentioned it just now with the planning, about the planner's judgment. and his own assessments of where the critical path might run, etc. I think the same applies to delay analysts, where they have to make a lot of judgment calls in interpreting data, the facts of the project, the facts of the delays, and how they've actually affected critical path or not critical path, and what the impact has been. So I think it's really important that delay analysts actually understand the project and how they're being undertaken and managed. If you don't understand that, you're going to struggle because you won't be able to make the right judgment calls. In my experience, and we're talking largely about EPC contracts here, the construction element is usually quite well understood by delay analysts, but in my experience, very few understand the engineering and procurement aspects and how those are impacted by events, and then how the events that are impacting engineering carry through to construction. And I think the thing that's missing for most is that there's a very iterative process between engineering and procurement, and it's by no means straightforward to analyse, and you really need to understand the engineering procurement process and the interactions between the two. You know, for instance, I've seen delay analysis done where the analyst has said, oh, the purchase order was placed late, therefore the equipment must be delivered late. Well, that's not really the case, because there's usually sufficient time, unless you're talking about long lead items that are highly critical, then we have some exceptions, but general equipment, it will not usually result in a late delivery to the site because there's enough time to do it. The problem usually arises with late purchase orders. As an example, the contractor does not get the engineering deliverables, the vendor data from the vendors, because he hasn't placed the purchase order. That impacts his detailed engineering, which then has a ramification through. So you've got to understand those processes really well. And I think one area that's, I believe, is consistently overlooked in delay analysis is the management decisions that are made during the life of a project, which determine how events are handled and how the project is managed to get around some of the events. And those management decisions really make a big difference between what the original plan looks like compared to what the actuality is. And by not dealing with that, you miss key elements of the analysis. And I'd just like to give a little example here to try and illustrate the point, because people often, they focus on something that they think is a real issue that's going to cause, you know, a delay or a major problem that is supporting perhaps the extension of time claim, when in fact, when you look at the real story, it isn't the case. So a few years ago, I was appointed by council for the contractor as project management expert on an EPC project for a gas plant, and there were several units to this. And interestingly, by the time I was appointed, the arbitration had been running for 9 years, so that plenty of practice. And I was tasked by council to tell what he said, tell the project story. Which was an interesting request. And at that time, the team was swamped by data. For example, that 36 LibreArch files full of delay analysis. And I could understand why they were confused, because I was. And one of the very many issues was the weld failure rate on one of the units, and which the owner had focused on in his defence, and had gone to great lengths and, I guess, expense to employ welding experts to write long technical reports about the welding quality, together with cost of delay analysis as well. And there's a lot of analysis about the delay impact. So, and the contractor was having some difficulty in rebutting the arguments put forward by the owner. Well, the simple fact was he didn't have a defence to the welding quality, because when we look into it, there was a weld failure rate on this particular unit of 40%, which is astronomical, absolutely disastrous. because the welt failure rate in industry standard is no more than 2% for the particular welding that they were doing. So I'm not a welding expert by any means, but I do enjoy jigsaw puzzles, and I like getting all the little pieces together to go into one picture. So as soon as I see that there's this sort of welt failure rate, I start asking questions. Okay, why have we got this difference? And when you look into it, the unit that this welt failure rate occurred on was actually quite a small unit. And what had happened is the contractor there was major delays on the project anyway, as you might imagine. The contractor, in discussion with the owner, was focusing on the other critical units and appointed another subcontractor to do the work here. So he put his best resources onto the units that were critical, and he was a little bit not so careful in selecting his contractor, and hence we get a major disaster in the weld failure rates. Now, that was clearly a management decision over this issue of where to focus the best resources. And it was probably the right decision, because this unit that we're talking about with the high weld failure rate was non-critical to completion. It was relatively small. So he discovered the problems. He put right at his own cost the failed welds. They got to a level of accepted industry, and that was the story. But in the arbitration, the owner focused on this and tried to imply that the quality of the contractor's work was substandard across the project. Now, it's not a really great idea, because statements like that can so easily be rebutted. You've only got to look at the weld records for the rest of the job to see that they were achieving less than 2% weld failure rate to kill the argument. But then, from my point of view, when I'm looking at the project management as an expert, I then wonder how much more of the allegations of the owner's experts are equally as misleading. And that then sets in train a series of questions, particularly for the tribunal, who in this case happened to be a panel of 3 eminent lawyers who don't really concern themselves with weld failure rates too much. But it is counterproductive to start a story like this. You've got to look at the facts, you've got to put them into context, you've got to look at what the management decisions were, and you've got to be realistic. And so often I've found is that people start telling stories about things that are totally irrelevant. And that sends the dispute and arbitration off completely in the wrong track and waste a hell of an amount of time and money discussing things that are not really germane to the real problem. So I thought just an example, Alex, of facts are important, but it's also the right facts and interpreting them and understanding and applying them. So I think what we have to remember is that most delay analysis is undertaken after the event. And in this particular case, a long time after the event. And therefore, the reliability of the delay analysis is highly dependent upon the amount and quality of the records that are available and the delay analysis ability to make sense of and utilize those records. And it's often left to the delay analyst to decide which of the many delay analysis methods to apply. And I've found that this is also a bit problematic at times. And therefore, I think that the combination of all these issues frequently leads to situations where the delay analysis prepared by the party making the claim differs greatly from the one that's defending it, even though they're both basically working with the same information. And I think it's confused and confounded many trial judges and arbitrators as to why there is this gaping gap of difference of opinion. So I think what I'd like to know from you is, What type of delay analysis is typically favoured by the courts and tribunals, and why?
Good question, John. And just to touch on your example, I think it's a great example because before I go into these methods, I think the thing to keep in mind, based on what John just said, is think about the reality of the situation. You know, that example was all about the importance of the facts and the importance of the reality. And scheduled delay analysis, as we said at the outset, is this dark art. Well, you know, it can be, but really delay is all about the facts. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And before answering John's question, I'm going to introduce a document, which is the Society of Construction Law Delay and Disruption Protocol. It's currently in its 2nd edition and it's freely available online. It's a well-known document in construction law, and it has the object of providing, as it quotes, useful guidance on some of the common delay and disruption issues that arise on construction projects. And I would say it does that very, very well. And it explains a lot of the concepts that we're talking about today, and it is commended to you as a document to refer to in terms of delay and disruption. I'll be referring to it as we go. And as I say, in particular, there's a much fuller explanation of some of the things in that document that we will talk about today. Before we get into the methods, I think it's first important to understand that there are several methods to schedule delay analysis. And as a more junior lawyer, I seem to remember that being a new one on me, because how many methods can there be to analyzing a delay? You know, it was either late or it wasn't, isn't it? Well, no. I've got an example to share with you here. So I once attended a presentation from a delay expert, and he set a very simple scenario. He said, I am building a gate at the end of my drive. That's the project. So he told us that he needed to construct a gate post and procure and install a gate. It's a very simple construction project, as you can appreciate. So what he did was he mapped out a simple schedule of the activities that he needed to complete in order to build the gate post and hang the gate on it. And he showed us the critical path that ran through those activities. And there must have been about 15 activities on the schedule, let's say. The next thing he did was he impacted the critical path by some delay events. So he threw in some facts that meant that there was a delay. So the gate wasn't ready on time, this sort of thing. He showed us a simple delay analysis, but what he did was he used each of the main methods of delay analysis. And the results of this were surprising. It seemed that, depending on which method of delay analysis he used, he could show that there was either a substantial critical delay, a minimal critical delay, no critical delay at all, or an accelerated finish that meant that the project completed before its original completion date. And the only difference was the method that was used to establish the delay, because the facts stayed the same. So I give this example not to make any particular comment on delay experts or what they do for a living, but just to show that the method of delay analysis that is used can be very important, and it's incumbent upon everyone involved in the case to understand the method that is going to be used and why. And it's worth reinforcing that the example given was a very, very simple project, and that the engineering construction projects with which we are all more familiar are much more complex. So you can only imagine what happens when you apply several different methodologies of delay analysis to a more complex project. So we'll do a quick poll, and the poll question is, how many useful methods of delay analysis do you think there are? It's a simple 1, 2, 3, or 5. Let's see what you think. Again, just click on the answer that you think is correct. See, we have some results coming. And we've gone for, okay, 3, 40%, 24, 2%. Nobody thinks it's 1. That's interesting. And then a split between 4 or 5. It's a debatable question, I think. Useful is the word in that question that is open to substantial discussion, I think. What I would say is that there are recognized as probably five main methods of delay analysis, and I'll explain each of those. I'll just tell you what they are first. As planned versus as built is number 1. Impacted as planned is number 2. Collapsed as built is number 3. Windows analysis is number 4. And time impact analysis is number 5. Those are the primary methods that tend to be most commonly used. It's important to remember that whichever method is used, they each have advantages and disadvantages. So some methods are more appropriate when the delay is being assessed prospectively rather than retrospectively. And each method aims to identify and assess the causes of delay, the duration and the timing of delay to activities, and the overall impact of these delays on the completion date. So you can see how that is useful in an extension of time claim, no matter which methodology you use. The SCL delay and disruption protocol makes the sound observation that whichever method is used, the overriding objective is to ensure that the conclusions derived from the analysis are sound from a common sense perspective. And that's a good thing to bear in mind. If it makes no sense, it's probably not worth putting forward. Let's go through the methods. So the first method that I mentioned was the as planned versus as built method, and it's probably one of the more straightforward ones. It does pretty much what it says. It is a simple comparison between the as planned schedule and as built schedule. So it's a comparison between what the contractor originally planned and what actually happened. This is an analysis that can be supported by witness evidence and other forms of analysis, such as manpower and resource analysis. What it requires is an agreed as planned schedule and as built records that have enough detail to allow the comparison to be made. So this is a method that is very much dependent on the information being available. And if it is available, it's quite straightforward. The only limitation, or maybe the main limitation with this method, is if the original plan schedule was unrealistic, because the baseline upon which you are comparing things to is not to be trusted. It's fairly simple, it's relatively inexpensive, and it identifies the facts of what happened. I think the drawback is, while it identifies the events causing delay, it doesn't identify the causes or the impact on the completion date. So all it shows you is the scheduled delay. So it can be criticized as being superficial compared to some of the other methods. The second one, impacted as planned. This method, you take the planned schedule and make adjustments to it. And the adjustments are made to reflect events that may have had an impact on the progress to the works. So you could categorize this as a dynamic updating of the as planned schedule. And the revised schedule that you produce as a result of that exercise is then used to show the impact of the changes to the original schedule. Important point, it doesn't consider any actual progress nor an as-built schedule, so it doesn't particularly rely on any actual records. It requires a reasonable planned baseline schedule. It requires suitable logic links and assumptions so that it can be updated successfully. And it also requires an evidential basis for the impact of the changes to it. So you can't just pull events out of the air. They have to be grounded in some form of reality. The impact of the events are considered individually in order to quantify the overall delay. So again, the success of the method really depends on how adequate the baseline schedule is. If the baseline schedule is no good, the analysis can be undermined quite easily. But I think its major weakness is that it can be very easily criticized for being entirely theoretical and not grounded in the facts. It doesn't refer at all to what happened on the project. And it can be perceived as a contractor-friendly form of analysis because it doesn't consider the contractor's own delays or any mitigation of delay or any acceleration measures that may have been implemented. So there is a tendency for this form of analysis to overstate a delay, and it can be attacked by contradictory factual evidence. So John's example can probably undermine this form of an analysis because you can show, well, This is the fact of what happened. The next one, time impact analysis. This uses an as-planned schedule and it impacts that schedule with the effect of delay events. It's a form of prospective analysis. It aims to analyze the impact of the relevant delay on the project at the time it occurred. And it's sometimes referred to as a snapshot analysis, which I think is a much better description because it is a snapshot of the project schedule before the delay occurred, which is then impacted by the effect of the event. So the delay event is fed into the updated master as planned schedule, and then it's modeled through to completion of the works to show what happened as a result of it. The start of the analysis, in this case, I think is better than some methods because it's dictated by the timing of the particular delay event that's being considered rather than an arbitrary date. And we'll come on to that in the Windows analysis, which we're looking at next. So the success of this particular method, again, it relies on the reasonableness of the updated as planned schedule, which is used as the baseline, because if that's not realistic, then any prospective analysis could be flawed. It has the advantage of tracking the as-built status through the project based on the delays as they occur. But the disadvantage is it can be difficult to prepare this form of an analysis if you have overlapping or concurrent delaying events rather than sequential delay events that impact on the progress. Let's discuss Windows analysis. There are two types of Windows analysis, time slice or as planned versus as built. Both of those methods aim to establish the contemporaneous or the actual project critical path. The method involves breaking the project into manageable periods or windows in which the critical path and the impact of the events causing delay are considered. So this form of analysis is good for big complex projects that have long schedules because it makes the analysis more manageable. It chops it up into chunks as opposed to dealing with the whole thing. It's usually used where the baseline schedule is reasonable and where it's been regularly updated over the course of the project. So in each window, the delay expert will analyze the critical path, determine the critical path, and then determine the extent of any delay to completion, or a time saving, as it could be in some windows. The analysis of the causes of delay in each window requires an analysis of the as-planned and as-built data and contemporaneous records. The windows could be arbitrary, but usually they are established by reference to significant project milestones or significant changes in the critical path. And the extent of the delay in the window is established by comparing the as-planned and as-built dates for those activities that are on the critical path. So it identifies the likelihood of critical delay having occurred or time being saved within a window and then adds it all up at the end. And the major advantage of this type of analysis is it seeks to analyze the causes of delay contemporaneously, and it has a firm basis in the as-built records. So it relies heavily on what actually happened. It's also quite user-friendly, I think, and particularly for major projects because it is more easily digestible. Anything is more easily digestible when it's chopped into manageable pieces. So a disadvantage which follows from what I just said is it's only as good as the quality of the as-built records which it relies upon. How successful this method is depends on how good the records are, and it can be expensive. But I think costs can be saved with this method if you have good records and the schedule has been regularly updated throughout the works. So the final method is the collapsed as-built. Now this is the opposite of impacted as planned, which we discussed earlier. So this one is where you work backwards. Here you start with the as-built program as the baseline and work backwards by extracting in reverse chronological order the apparent effect of delay events to show what would have happened to the project but for those delaying events. So all of the employer delay events are removed from the as-built schedule, which leaves a theoretical schedule that aims to show the completion date that the contractor would have achieved without the employer having caused delay. Again, good quality as-built records are needed to produce the theoretical program because without that, what are you going to extract from it? Again, a disadvantage of this method is it's theoretical although it at least benefits from starting from a factual as-built position instead of a notional as-planned position. But again, it depends on the adequacy of the as-built program. So if the as-built program is no good, the analysis will again be flawed. Further drawbacks: this method does not identify concurrent delay, nor does it consider acceleration or resequencing that might have actually occurred. And it only considers the final critical path in the as-built schedule, not the contemporaneous critical path, which may change. So it can distort conclusions that are made about the contractor's performance. So, for example, if the effect of an employer delay slows down the pace of the contractor's performance elsewhere on the site, this method doesn't necessarily take that into account. So for these reasons, I think this method has quite limited application. And I will mention one more. We said there were 5, but some say there are 6. There is another analysis which is called longest path analysis, and I'm only going to briefly say that the SCL protocol describes this method as having limited capacity to recognize and allow for switches in the critical path during the course of the works. That's a fairly major disadvantage. So I think if a delay expert is considering a longest path analysis, there have to be very clear reasons for doing that. So in summary, it was a very, very long answer to John's question, but the more real, the more compelling the analysis. The less theory, the more compelling the analysis. In its first revision of the protocol, the Society of Construction Law suggested that time impact analysis was favoured. In the current protocol, which is the 2nd edition, it doesn't really specify a favoured methodology, but what it does say is the parties should not wait and see when it comes to assessing the impact of delay events. So carrying out a contemporaneous analysis is best practice. And that also fits with contracts such as the NEC forms of contract which require compensation events to be prospectively assessed. So I think it's probably still the case that time impact analysis is generally favoured among the courts and tribunals, although in large projects I've seen windows analysis used because I think they make it more digestible. So John, I'll hand back to you. In your experience, what determines the use of which particular method?
I think there are 3 main determining factors. I think the first one is, what does the contract say? Does it specify a particular methodology, as some do? Are there any specific requirements concerning the delay analysis? So we've got to go back to the contract, because in any dispute situation, we're going to be held to that. I think then the next determining factor is the complexity of the problem. So very simply, is there a single obvious delay, for example, force majeure, or are there multiple events which are variously the responsibility of the both contracting parties? So it's really, how difficult a job is it really? What do we have to prove, and how are we going to prove it? And the third is the availability of contemporaneous project records, basically starting with the baseline schedule and the manpower loading, and hopefully a project execution plan and a construction execution plan that can pull everything together. So I think that those are the main issues, the main drivers. I'd just like to say something about the second point, which is a single event. In my experience on these sort of projects, there's rarely one single delay event that occurs. And yet, I've been involved in disputes where the focus has been on, let's say, the easy solution being force majeure. And what I've learned about it is that force majeure is not an easy option by any means. And it's a bit of a dangerous game to focus on one event, because there may well be a force majeure that's caused 3 months delay, it may well be true or not. But what happens if you just select that one event to get that extension of time, and of course we don't get any money for it neither, is that the other side have only got one target, and therefore the pressure is on defeating the concept of force majeure.
Yeah.
And the components of force majeure can be quite difficult to prove depending on the circumstances. So you put all eggs in one basket, which is not a great idea. And I was involved in one just a couple of years ago where there were two main events that the contractor focused on. One was force majeure, and one was another breach of contract for access by the owner in some areas. But it was an EPC contract, and what the contractor and his delay expert had not looked at was the impact of the owner actually changing the size. It was a power plant, changing the size of the turbine hall physically, because it wasn't big enough to hold the job. It was 2.5 years before all the other stuff started, and it sort of got overlooked, and they hadn't inquired far enough that seen two big events. This is what we'll go for. Where in actual fact there were other underlying events that had also time impact that overlapped. So I think you've got, in any situation, you've got to step back and look at the bigger picture and then decide which sort of analysis is really going to suit those circumstances, rather than just saying, oh, a simple analysis, we can prove, we can prove force majeure by just doing this. I don't think our life in this industry is that simple, ever. And therefore, my advice is to step back. But let's have a poll, Wayne, to see what people think. If you're looking at deciding on which delay analysis to use, which method to use, what do you think? Should the party look at it and decide? Their lawyers, a delay analyst, a claims consultant, or should it be a joint discussion? What do you think is the best way to get to the right delay analysis method? Okay, Wayne, what are we looking at? Yeah, I go with the majority. I think it really does require a joint discussion, because each one of those groups of people will have their own views on, and I see the parties' lawyers are not involved. I'm surprised at that, because there is the burden of proof issue that has to be addressed.
Yeah.
But I think it is it's an overall discussion that needs to take place, because there will be different views, and then you have to distill those out and come to a landing on what is the most appropriate.
Yeah.
So Alex, what do you see as the problems in terms of inadequacies of schedule delay analyses and expert witness reports when we're getting into dispute?
Yeah, I think the major problem is one that I've sort of hinted at already, which is the more hypothetical seeming the analysis that the delay expert carries out, the more I would be tempted to treat the report with considerable suspicion. So in my experience, the more hypothetical the analysis that's been used, the less likely it is based on project records, which suggests to me that the records are either limited or not available to support the analysis by reference to the facts. I think in terms of schedule delay analysis generally, I think there can be a tendency towards what we might describe as magical thinking, which is the tendency for parties to think that in the absence of detailed contemporaneous factual records and in the absence of a properly produced and updated schedule, a delay expert can somehow work their magic and produce a compelling analysis. And they can certainly produce an analysis, but what I'm saying is it won't be the best type of analysis. And to pick up a point I addressed earlier, ultimately delay analysis is a matter of fact, and it should be ascertained in accordance with the project records. And the courts have said expert delay analysis is at most an area of expert evidence which may assist the court. The delay analysis of itself is not determinative, and it's the records, not the expert, that are the most important. So I think you could have a truly great delay expert, and there are a few of those, but the analysis can be undermined if it doesn't rest on a bedrock of facts. So if it doesn't reflect what actually happened, it will always be subject to criticism and attack. So in terms of how a party can help itself, I think the more contemporaneous factual records that can be given to the delay expert, the better. The more accurate the schedules and the more updates to the schedules, the better, because not only will the expert report be of a better quality, it will also probably be cheaper to produce because the expert isn't hunting around trying to establish the facts. And as with claims in general, I think the more real-time and factual the evidence is, the better its quality. I've got a couple of examples. The first example is I was in a position of advising an owner in relation to a claim where the schedules hadn't been updated. So the contractor had only produced 2 accepted schedules in a 3-year project, and one of those was at the very beginning. So it was very difficult for the delay expert to produce an analysis. However, our client had a clerk of works who was on site every day, and he kept comprehensive site diaries. He literally wrote down what happened in a book, detailing the activities that the contractor was carrying out, when they started, when they finished, what they were doing. And that was invaluable contemporaneous evidence because our delay expert was able to use it to construct a record, a factual record, which he could then do a time impact analysis on to identify the effects of the events that caused delay. So our client succeeded on the claim, but the lack of adequate schedules and revisions, I think, is all too typical. It's not fatal, though, if the records are there. And the second example was an unusual one where we as lawyers, again, for an owner, created an entirely factual delay analysis for ourselves based on a simple as planned versus as built type analysis without a delay expert, based only on the contractor's monthly progress reports. And we could do that because the monthly progress reports were comprehensive. They ran to hundreds of pages with detailed explanation and updated schedules that reported progress and delay to certain events. And we took that and we looked at the facts that we had. We could explain those delays. So I suppose we almost used the contractor's own documents against it in order to establish a case for delay. And that was a unique situation, but I think it demonstrates that fundamentally the delay expert is an option rather than a necessity, because the delay is a question of fact and it can be established simply by the factual documentation. So I think in an ideal world, our clients will keep comprehensive records and they will ensure that schedules are updated in accordance with the contract. And I think if they can do that, then the less work there is for a delay expert, and in theory the better quality and the lower cost of the schedule delay analysis. And I think tribunals are more likely to be impressed by that than they are the more theoretical analysis. So John, practical terms, what are the pitfalls of appointing delay experts, and what do you need to prepare for delay analysis before appointing them?
I think the first thing we have to recognise is that delay analysis and delay analysts are expensive, whichever way you look at it. They also come in a wide range of experience, expertise and competencies. So you've got to get the right person or persons to do the work for you. And I think if you're going to use a delay analyst in arbitration or litigation, then apart from the technical competence, they also need to be able to deal with cross-examination. So they need to be able to stand up to, attack from the other side, which is sometimes quite difficult. And you can have a great report, but if the guy can't, if he doesn't know his report, and this has been the criticism of some fairly well-known judges and arbitrators, that they've been amazed at the experts not knowing their own reports. And this is no good. You can have the greatest report on earth, but if the guy can't speak to it, it's useless. I think the other thing is that most delay analysts are not claims writers, and we shouldn't expect them to be. Some are pretty competent, but in the main, they're not. And as with any specialist appointment, delay analysis needs to be briefed thoroughly and then managed. And in my experience, a lot of people just appoint the delay analyst and let them get on with it. And I don't think that's a good idea for either party, either the hirer or the one that's hired, because they need to know precisely what you want them to deliver, and tell them and make sure so that you get what you expect for what you're paying for. So the briefing is absolutely fundamental, so that they know where you are, what the expectations are, and where they're to focus, because they have a tendency to wander into areas that are not really the issue, and because they aren't briefed. I think the other thing is we shouldn't accept on face value what we're told. I think there's a real need to challenge analysis, especially project teams. The teams have lived with the project, they know what the reality is. And therefore, if there's an outcome of an extension of time or something, how credible is it? How does the report explain it? How's it going to be challenged? And more importantly, how did the delay analysts come to the conclusions that they have, and on what basis? Because if the project team don't support it and they're going to be witness of fact, we're going to have a bit of a conflict between experts and witnesses of fact. Not a great idea for winning arbitrations. And if you want your delay analyst to perform well, you have to facilitate the conditions and circumstances to enable him to do so. You can't get in the way. You can't, you've got to give them information. You've got to work with them. And so often, and I've heard delay analysts say, we don't get the information, we don't get briefed properly. We're shown into a room with a pile of documents and the doors closed behind us, and in 3 months we're expected to produce, in the words of Boris Johnson, a world-beating delay analysis. They can't do it. It's not real. It's not correct. So they've got to be briefed, they've got to be shown the documents, you've got to prepare the documents. I'll come back to that in a minute. So all the documentation that is available for delay analysts needs to be identified, packaged, and put in a place where they've got access to it, whether that's electronic or physical, it doesn't really matter, so that they can get on with their investigation. This is part of the facilitation. If you want them to perform, give them the means to perform. But the project team needs to put that information together, not a team of delay analysts. And the reason for that is that the project team knows the project and the documentation that's available. And today we have tons of documentation. Much of it is irrelevant to the subject. It's far cheaper for the project team to do it, without doubt, than a team of analysts. And the delay analyst knows from the start the length and breadth and depth of the data that he's got available. So there's no point in asking for anything else, because it's all there. That's all you have to work with. And of course, that's important for him to be able to, him or her, to be able to make up their minds. How are they going to tackle this problem? You can't make a judgment call until you've seen the material. To go back to your omelet, if you don't know where the eggs are, you're going to be struggling. Yeah. So I'd like to come back to your question on the information that needs to be put together before any delay analysis starts, or even before you appoint a delay analyst. And I've had a look at this, and there's about 40 to 50 issues that need to be addressed. And I'd just like to pick on the first one, which is questions around the baseline schedule, just as an example of the type of things that we need to be asking and finding out before we even start thinking about it. It's only to do with the baseline schedule. So first of all, does the contract require the contractor to provide one? In most cases, the answer to that will be yes, but what does the contract actually say about this? And if the contract does say so, well, is there one? Is there a baseline schedule, and does it satisfy the criteria set out in the contract? It's a yes or no question, or the answer is. Does the contract contain a single completion date, or is it multiple? And how are these reflected in the baseline schedule? Are there a series of milestones? Have we got them all? Are they in the right place? I've seen baseline schedules with the milestones either forgotten, not included, or in the wrong dates. Not helpful. Is the baseline schedule accompanied and supported by a project and construction execution plan? The schedule is only telling us what the number of activities that are going to plan to take place and the timing. It doesn't tell us anything about how or who. And those are two fundamental questions we need to know the answer to, because they will affect the outcomes in the way that resources are being deployed and or the work has been executed. The method statement is really quite important. Do you have the original planner's notes on how he prepared the schedule? What assumptions and presumptions did the planner make? Because there are numerous judgment calls and decisions that have to be made. You mentioned them earlier about the critical path and where that runs. It's the planner's decision to a large extent. Some things will be obvious, but there still is room for, we'll run it through this route or we'll run it through that route. So what was he thinking about? That assumes that he was thinking, of course. And did he keep notes of it? They're really important because it's contemporaneous record that's relevant to the formation of the baseline plan. And does the contract require the baseline plan to be approved by the owner? And has it been? And how long did it take? And of course, the last thing is, and we've been involved in a number of projects where the baseline schedule has taken so long to get approved that it's been used as a measuring device and has been updated and is no longer a baseline schedule because it's been progressed. So we don't know what happened in the preceding 9 months up to getting it approved, and it had changed shape and size. So there's a whole rake of questions along these lines that need to be asked before you start. And if you don't ask them, then you're heading into a black hole of uncertainty, because almost certainly these issues will crop up at some stage during the analysis, and that's when it starts to get really expensive.
Absolutely. So I think to close that out, we only have a couple of minutes left. I think I would say, picking up the point about being expensive, I think good delay experts they're definitely few and far between. So I would say if you have a delay issue on a project and you need an expert, and I think particularly if it's high value and it's important and it's complex, make sure you get a good one. We would always recommend that interviewing potential experts together with your lawyers and project team members is a good idea, because you not only need to have the confidence in that individual's ability to write a report, but as John said, probably ultimately also they might be giving oral testimony in court and being cross-examined, and so it's important to understand how they might perform and what kind of experience they have of that. In a recent trial, I thought it was quite interesting that some of the most experienced experts didn't actually make the best witnesses, because they came across as being more sort of interested in their own opinions, and they were less inclined to acknowledge the opinions of others. And so I think having an expert who's quite real and genuine is also important, because they tend to be more impressive. And in terms of their instructions, I would always recommend that those are tightly drafted and tightly controlled, and make sure that the brief is precisely defined, because I think, as John said, experts like to investigate everything, but often there's a need to prioritize what they should be tasked to consider, particularly at the outset. And I think finally, we say it so often, we probably say it every time, make sure that good contemporaneous records are kept, filed away in an archive where they can be easily accessed and retrieved. As we said in the first webinar in this series, if you make an allegation, you have to be able to prove it. So to prove a claim, and to help an expert produce a compelling delay analysis and a good report, I think those good quality records are an absolute necessity. So there we are. We've been talking about delay and we finished bang on time, which I think is good. Again, if this webinar made you think of any specific issues or questions, then please talk to us about it. Get in touch with John or myself. John mentioned all these questions that he has for considering whether to engage a delay expert. I think what we'll do is we'll put together a package after this webinar series that contains the sort of information that we think you might find helpful or useful, and we'll remind you of that in the subsequent webinars. So if you're interested in that, send us an email as well. Next time, 3 weeks today, 17th of September, 12 noon, the same time, UK time, we'll be looking at money. We've spent a lot of time on time, so we'll talk about money next. Our topic is value, cost and damages, and we'll be talking about recognizing the differences, when to apply, and the evidential documentation required to prove the case. So thanks again for your time. It's been a pleasure. Hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye. Good day.
Bye.